Good afternoon and welcome to Corny and Barrow's series of wine podcasts. This afternoon is Bordeaux Unpicked. We're breaking stride from Burgundy as we will soon be going there, which we will detail more. And I'm joined this afternoon with Mr. Seddon. Hello, Guy.
Hello, Joe.
And Mr. Hargrave. William, hello.
Hello, Mr. Mann.
Wonderful, wonderful. So we obviously have been amongst knee deep in Burgundy podcasts and releases, but as always, before we know it, Bordeaux season seems to come up quickly, surprises from the flanks, and we are into April. And next week we will be visiting over to Bordeaux on the right bank and left bank to get a good idea of 2024 as a vintage, the pending en primeur sales, which we hope to be a quick campaign, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on the podcast. But I thought maybe start with... Well, you both actually went out for a little long weekend to Bordeaux.
Well, a long couple of days, Mr. Mann. It was a Tuesday, Wednesday, but no, you're quite right. I think it's also interesting to note that pre-COVID, we would have been there now tasting. So when everyone goes to taste has gone back a couple of weeks, which actually is something that I think people kind of wanted to have happened earlier anyway. It's better for the wines, weather's better, all sorts of things. So yeah, we did. We just nipped out, Guy, Adam and I, to see some of the people we work with directly and Negociant and a couple of other bits and pieces, because unusually for Bordeaux, there'd been relatively little chat coming out of the Negociants or the Chateaus about the vintage, whereas normally we're being told it's those two categories of Bordeaux vintages, either vintage of the century or better than expected, which is the only two options we're often given. But no, joking aside, it was just to go and touch base with people. Actually, it was a really useful exercise. So,
And who did you visit? I think you saw Francois Micheville and Milut,
Micheville, Moex. Also saw Petrus very briefly, but less to taste, just to have a chat. So no, it was good.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, yeah, we can dig into both of those aspects a little bit more. Should we start with So I think what people want to know, and Guy, maybe you'll start us off in a moment once we've discussed this, what you've actually tasted about the vintage. What's 24 Bordeaux like so far that you've had?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Well, it's at this time of year always a tricky one because, we are standing on the precipice of a new vintage, but we haven't actually tasted many, if any, of the wines. And so all we really have to go on at this time of year is reputation and what people are saying. As Will says, there's a sort of refreshing absence of hype or hyperbole, which sometimes comes out at this juncture. We're staring into the unknown in a sense, but we know roughly what the growing season looked like, and so we can make a few deductions based on that. Is it worth it if I go through a very brief kind of synopsis?
Yeah,
why not? The season, and then we can draw out some themes from that.
Let's do that.
Without going into the nitty-gritty detail, the growing season did see quite a lot of moisture, so that there was above average rainfall in the winter and the early spring. That led into an early bud burst. Unfortunately, there was no frost damage. So we're looking at a vintage where that early period of damage, which can so sort of scathe the nascent vintage, that was avoided, which is a good thing. There was then some heavy rain in March, and that really heralded the beginning of this system of mildew pressure, which is one of the themes that you'll see recurring throughout the 24 season. And it did become a sort of defining influence of the vintage. There were various estimates, but I mean, roughly a fifth to a quarter, I think, of the crop was probably sacrificed on the altar of mildew in 24. That's what it is. And there have been instances of very low volumes over the last modern vintages coming out of Bordeaux. So not in itself a disaster, and sorting, just becomes even more important as a result of that. On the more positive side of things, there was a really good summer, and this, I think, is probably something that we need to bear in mind when we're talking about 24. Yeah. That it's quite easy to listen to the naysayers to begin with, and actually there was a 6-week period in the middle of the summer, went from middle of July through to the end of August, where the summer had sunshine, the weather was really very good, and it was something like 50% above the average sunshine for a certain period of time. However, September was then wet again. I think there was sort of a universal hope that there would be a late season burst of ripeness. I'm looking at Mr. Hargrave, who's hoping that I don't say Indian summer, which I've said it now. But anyway, that didn't materialise. And
not how we wanted anyway, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it sort of came a little bit after harvest, didn't it?
Well, yes.
Yeah.
And so harvest was quite a protracted affair. I think, it did endure for the majority of September and even into October for some of the reds and for the sweet whites. And the upshot was that the vintage was small, in itself not a disaster, as I say. And I think from this sort of very brief run through the season, we can draw out a few themes. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that the skins were quite thick. So I think in general, there will be a decent amount of polyphenols, of tannins. So, I mean, you're going to have wines of texture. The fruit character, I mean, Will and I tasted a few wines when we were out there recently. And for me, they were sort of falling more into the red fruit character than the black fruit character.
I
So
agree
there's a
with
sort of
that.
crunchiness to the fruits, which I think we may see more of. The acidity is on the high side. That is inevitable if you get a cooler growing season. Think of 21, for example, as the most recent manifestation of that. And alcohol is on the low side. So, those two things are not bad things in themselves. So, I think those are some early themes, but the proof, as always, will be in actually getting out there and tasting the wines.
It'll be interesting to see whether the dreaded sort of classic word comes out. And I don't mean that in it being a modern classic, but they are more, some of the proportions are potentially more classic with the lower alcohol, the higher acidity, I guess. It'll be interesting to see when we taste a little bit more, but they're not going to be, it's not going to be an American style vintage in any way, shape or form with sort of dark colours and,
Yeah, definitely. I think it's going to be really interesting exercise actually when we come back from Bordeaux, having delved into more detail with all the growers, especially those that we work very closely with, but also tasting the full range as normal, then listening back. But, from what you've just said there, it sort of reminded me as well, because obviously the age of social media, and you see these things happening throughout the year when reports come in of weather patterns. And for me, it's sort of, there's low yields, as you said. Selection is obviously going to be a massive component to the amounts, which we can sort of talk a little bit more on when we come on to the sort of the discussing the market, because clearly yields are low. We've got that mildew pressure. As you said, the growing season started quite warm and wet, and so vegetation went bursting into life. There was early budding, then the rains came. That always then means, and correct me if I'm wrong, normally indicates it's probably Millerandage and Couillot. So Couillot with being small, berries not forming at all, and the former being uneven berries, unripe berries amongst normal, perfectly sized berries. And so again, selection coming in from those two categories could be something that's in contention alongside all the effects that mildew had. And we did have that warm summer, and I think that's what hopefully will allow for some pretty aspects to the wine to shine. The other thing which is probably worth touching on is the big rain that came in September, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So we've discussed this with previous vintages, not on the podcast, but just generally amongst everyone, as wine lovers. You'll talk, think 1998, think 2012. You had these sort of big differences in rainfall times between and picking dates with Merlot and Cabernet, and that will come into play. Not that it was a pour, from my understanding, a downpour on one date on the left bank and a downpour on the other day on the right. I think it was continuous rain for quite a period, and the Merlot pickers managed to get in there before the Cabernet possibly, and we'll see how that pans out, and we'll be able to report more back on then. But I think I was saying this to you on the sales floor, certainly to you, Guy, and Nev the other day, and I don't know if this is just my own wishes. I mean, if I was involved in some of these decisions, or a winemaker or a chateau owner, I think what I would love to be doing with this vintage in 24. And this is, again, I'm going to caveat this, is before we've gone out and tasted anything, so it's going to be completely wrong. Is that I would be, let's focus on not pushing things too much. Don't push the extraction too much, because you mentioned about the anthocyanins and polyphenols being in abundance. That can mean a lot of texture, which can mean tannins. If there's not a huge amount of sunshine, sugar levels will probably a little bit of a challenge. So alcohol is going to be on the lighter side, and acids are going to be high. And it's how does the fruit balance that? We're going to have that sort of ripeness of fruit. I'd be saying, let's just try and make as pretty a style as possible. try and make it as approachable as possible, as finessed as possible, and just, be honest about this is a vintage that maybe, and again, I don't know if this is going to be correct, one that can be enjoyed earlier, and it can be one that, pulling corks in 4 years, 5 years will be the common theme. I don't know.
I think basically you want it to come down on the side of 2017 rather than the side of 21 potentially. So,
Yes.
I mean, without going into sort of too much specificity before we've even tasted the wines, I think the loveliness and sort of approachability to a slightly lighter vintage that you had in 17 is what I'm hoping for, and not the slightly more angular style of some of the 21s.
Yeah, and you're not going to sort of make a gem out of something that's got some tricky constituents. But I think it was quite interesting when we had, in fact, not in Bordeaux, but Bordeaux, very Bordeaux related. Guillaume was over from Calmé-Briand, and we tasted downstairs with the whole team. And he said exactly that. You had to be, and it's an overused word, and you hear it all over the wine world at the moment as we get these sort of slightly, overused words. But it's an infusion vintage. If you do exactly as you're saying, Joe, if you're in any way trying to force something, you're going to force stuff into the wine that you don't want, by which I mean, the sort of rougher tannins and what have you. So, I can completely agree. Make something tender and balanced with good freshness that people can drink relatively soon and move on. I think would be a good sort of watchword.
And on that note, the same tasting, we had their 21, and that is unbelievably brilliant. It had so much. I mean, it's Calmé-Briand. I know it's different, and they're using some whole bunch within there, but it just had this incredible profile of aromas, which I think it's fair to say that whole bunch, sort of investment gives it a lift, and it does. But it was so finessed, and
that's a great sort of example of why you shouldn't generalize about vintages. And actually, grower or chateau owner, chateau team is key. So follow what you love in terms of chateau rather than chasing the vintage.
Because hand on heart, I don't know about you, that in that one, that 21 was my favourite of the tasting versus we had the 20 as well.
I think I was 17 for the night and then 22 for the cellar. But I mean, I love the 21, so it was a cracker. And I think it'll be interesting, and maybe we'll move on to sort of producing things. But it's the kind of vintage that has the likes of someone like Francois Mitreville and the Moix team and stuff, people who really know their vineyards well and have had them for ages and know what they're doing and have a fairly firm hand on the tiller in terms of what they want. I think we'll see out pretty well.
Well, that's a good one as well, because Francois Mitreville has a bit of a reputation for making quite exemplary wines in those more challenging years. So
absolutely,
you guys, I know you tasted already there, and you have a more focused revisit soon. But was that the case for them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the early indication, we just tasted a bottle of a barrel sample, as it were, just before we sat down to lunch. So I mean, it wasn't a sort of exhaustive barrel tasting as we will do when we go back there.
But this time next week we'll be there, actually. I think.
Yeah. But I mean, the early indication was that very lovely wine. So fingers crossed.
I'm excited. I haven't tasted at Tetra Boeuf on Primeur for something like 6 or 7 years.
Well, just because it was the three of us, we made sure we had the 85 for lunch, but we'll be giving you a far lesser vintage.
What's the
we told Francois to get the good stuff out while it was just the three of us.
What I like about tasting with Francois is that you go down into a cellar and it's quite a sort of Burgundian experience. I know it's easy to say that, but he lets you choose a barrel. He says, any barrel, just tell me which one you want to taste and I'll stick a pipette in that one and let you have a taste. So many people, if they let you into the cellar at all, will have a barrel that they think is showing well, and that will be the one that they use for the purposes of En Primeur.
Yeah, and there's a little inside track and this isn't just in Bordeaux, this is anywhere. If you go to a tasting and you're fortunate enough to do a cellar tasting, quite often they'll have a little stone on top of the barrel which they want you to taste. So quite often it can be selected. It doesn't matter. There's the wines are going through different phases at different times, and they want to sort of make sure they're giving you a good representative.
I mean, I think you're sort of slightly edging towards an interesting point though, which will be. And yes, it's great that we taste a couple of weeks later than we used to traditionally, but these are going to be young wines. Obviously, we're tasting 6-7 months after harvest. It's going to be very interesting to see what the samples are like in terms of that. Will they be with the market, which I'm sure we'll come on to being not great at the moment? Will they be tempted to sort of sex up the samples a bit? I rather hope not. And I also don't think it's going to be a vintage in which second wines are going to be a thing. Whether they won't release them or whether they'll just make very little of them. But if they've done selection in a vintage where, as you say, Guy, the mildew pressure and what have you has been intense, it's going to be about them putting their best foot forward with their first wine.
Yeah.
And kind of that's that.
I'd agree with that, yeah. Well, moving on to the market, question for you both, and two, actually. So if you can maybe comment on where you think the market is generally for Bordeaux and how you think 24 may play out. And again, this is all just guesswork. We don't know. We will see how it unfolds. And actually, being in Bordeaux next week, we will see, I guess, how much of the PR sort of machine is in full flow. Who's there? For example, do you think America is going to be very active there, given recent news with Trump? Are we going to see a big representation of teams from the UK trade? I don't know. It's been quite an interesting one to witness.
I mean, we're going to spend to go on the second point first. We're going to spend probably a day or two less than we would normally. But we're going to spend all the time that we would normally, before the weekend with those we work with directly, and the weekend, and then we'll taste at the hangar and we'll taste at a couple of negotiation tastings. So we'll get to see a good spread of the wines, but as to how much they're going to feel there's a market for things and what the sort of reception post-Trump and things. I mean, I think, well, not post-Trump, but post-Trump's announcements.
Post-Independence Day.
Well, exactly. Yeah, I know there was a film about that once, which was slightly less dramatic than yesterday.
It's not Independence Day.
It was Liberation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But no, I think Bordeaux seems concerned for itself, which has not always been the case. And I think a lot of the time it's been not bluff and bluster, but there's been a lot of the PR scenario. I think they realise they've got a challenge on their hands, as we all probably have. But I think I would flip it on its head slightly and say the market for Bordeaux, the market for a brand new vintage of Bordeaux is kind of lukewarm. I think probably that's being generous. It's sort of tepid. But in terms of people starting to drink Bordeaux again a little bit at the top of the tree, I think that is starting to return. The problem, the challenge, whatever you want to call it, is that people have got a lot of wine that they've bought from previous vintages. And, there's been, from 14 onwards, with the exception of a few bits and pieces, few communes in one or two vintages, there's been pretty good wines all the way up to 20 and including 20. And then 22 is pretty serious as well. So it'll be interesting to see. But I think getting people to open bottles of Bordeaux. I mean, I had Grand Prix du Casse 16 2 nights ago. It was just absolutely delicious. And you think, well, that's what Bordeaux's got to do. That's what we've got to do is get people drinking the wines.
Yeah, I think we're possibly not representative. Well, we're definitely not representative of the sort of wine buying market out there, because there is a generational thing. And I mean, I'm not saying that we're sort of the older generation, but certainly there is a younger generation of Bordeaux, of wine lovers, who are not as drawn to Bordeaux as their parents' generation was. And I think this is a very Bordeaux-specific challenge. You've got the broader challenges of the wine market, and okay, we can talk about those, but in essence, they're linked to the broader economy. The Bordeaux-specific challenges are to do with an aging customer base for its wines, I think, in one sense, and the fact that people are no longer looking to buy wine en primeur to cellar for 20 years at all price levels, because A, that's not the way they particularly want to enjoy their wines these days, and B, they simply don't have the wallets or the patience to do so. And if you look at the UK as a sort of mature Bordeaux market, there's cellarage charges to factor into that as well. So if you're paying for 20 years of a wine to be professionally stored in a bonded warehouse, that's an expense in itself. And I think that needs to be factored in to the price which you're paying en primeur and makes sense in the context of previous vintages which are available for immediate consumption.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of a soapbox, but I think it's a structural concern which does affect the whole market.
It is, and we discuss this as a business amongst ourselves. And on that topic of the age, I think a message that would be quite good to pass on to the Bordelais is about that sort of age, because it's a certain group of younger wine lovers where Bordeaux is just not relevant to them. And it's not that they don't have any strong feelings of anti-Bordeaux or I don't like that. It's just that they've sort of grown up in a wine drinking world, and within wine bars the way they are have been over the last 10 years versus where they were over the previous 15 before that, and the listings and the rise of Burgundy and natural wines and producers with modern trends to drink sooner. I think it's a case where they just don't have any sort of understanding or haven't been drawn towards it. And it'd be good to really engage with those people. We're keen to do it if they can sort of help on that front, because like you said, there is also a change in Bordeaux where there are many wines now which you can appreciate so much younger than you did. Rather than you had to 20 years ago, 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. There's certain vintages, the 17s, the 16s. 16 is a great example because it's a brilliant Bordeaux vintage.
Yes,
but you've got that freshness from that acid, but you've got this core purity of fruit. But they also haven't, a lot of the producers pushed it in excess where it's all about, don't open this for another 20 years or 50 or 25 years. And the more that we can sort of champion those producers going down that path, I think is a good thing.
I mean, I would totally agree. I mean, La Fleur Petra 17 that I had recently, which we've all probably had recently.
Latour Pomerol 17.
And Latour Pomerol, yeah. Gorgeous, gorgeous wines. I think also it's going to be interesting that I think there will be, coming back into sort of 24 a little bit, there will be less wines released, which I think the en primeur system desperately needs because it needs a bit more focus. But I think producers, and Edouard hasn't confirmed exactly to us, but, the Moex there are one or two wines they normally make that they're not making. So I think that is a sign of commitment to quality, and I think is actually a sensible move.
Yeah.
A guy mentioned, reading through that, and obviously people don't talk about sort of biodynamics and organics and what have you in Bordeaux as much because it's an Atlantic climate. But, they were treating, and the amount of work and man hours that will have gone into this vintage is sort of completely chalk and cheese. It's this really weird scenario we have in wine where often the great vintages are quite plentiful, are quite easy, are quite straightforward and sell for quite nice prices. The lesser vintages are backbreaking, depressing, nerve-wracking, and a lot of work that then means they sell for a lot less. But that's nature. And I think we do need to react to that and not expect, which I think was a fear 15, 20 years ago, that we were going to get, a little like the New World perception for people that all the vintages are going to be the same and all this. It's fascinating that however climate change or whatever we want to call it, vintages there is certainly no homogenization of vintages. They're not becoming exactly the same. You go back over the last 7 or 8 years and there's a lot of good vintages, but there are a lot of good vintages in different ways.
Yeah. Well, I think on the market as well, a comment from me, I think in terms of how receptive it might be, actually two things which I think are worth noting for listeners. The secondary market, as we all know, has come off for the last 18 months. On average, 35%. This is no secret. And I think what we've seen certainly in the last sort of 3 months, 4 months, is an increase in people looking at Bordeaux with some age, buying it because there's value there in the secondary market. Some of those wines have come off to a price point where people are sort of taking serious note, going, "Oh, hang on, this is great. I'll take this Pichon Baron 1990. I'll take this Trotanoy 2001. The price this is at now." And this is nice because we want this sort of activity to sort of really help turn the market where we're plateaued now into sort of a steady incline for the rest of the year. Hopefully, I know. Big DT, the orange man across the Atlantic, is doing his best to sort of derail things. But on the whole, we are sort of cautiously optimistic for the rest of the year, how it'll play out. And the second point being Latour 16 came out, amongst a period of Burgundy en primeur, where a lot of Bordeaux bashing had taken place last year with the campaign, despite a good 24 estates really listening and getting their prices right. And it flew because they got the price pretty much, not spot on, but it was compelling enough to really warrant a lot of response from customers. We were inundated. We couldn't fulfill the amount of orders we had, and I'm guessing a lot of our competitors did as well. So I think for us, we're going to go out there, and you've already touched on these vintages, Guy. As a style, we're going to look at what it's like. We hope more towards 17. We can't help but think, when you're throwing the juggling balls of vintages in the air, 21's in the air, 17's in the air, 13 and 11 are in the air. And that's just because they're the most challenging vintages over the last sort of 15 years. So we're naturally going to sort of fall back on benching them against them. Therefore, I think also the market's likely to sort of look at those prices when it comes to the releases as well.
I mean, yeah, it's tricky. I mean, 11 was a real drought one. So,
Yeah.
but I understand what you in terms of the reception.
Terms of overall quality,
in terms of the reception to it,
I think 13 will continue to be an outlier in that sense as well. I don't think we should put that in the same basket.
Yeah, well, maybe 17 in time as well.
Yeah.
Because it is, 17 is lovely.
I mean, you mentioned about sort of a couple of dozen wines that got their price right last year, and obviously we actually had a pretty decent campaign last year. I think this is where we get into, and I think maybe this is why there's not been too much chat from Bordeaux, and there's not been a letter from the UK wine trade to Bordeaux, although someone in Bordeaux we spoke to said, it's definitely one of those vintages where we're expecting a stern letter from the Brits. Although we did one with our survey last year, I wouldn't say stern. We want these things to work. But it is going to be a tricky campaign. And I think what we can't do is expect blanket percentage decreases. I think people have started to talk in sort of quite financial terms like that about, it needs to be 20%, 30%, 40%, whatever. It all depends. It is all a case by case. And you and Max, Joe, did a very good job last year with sort of estimating the bracket so that we could say to customers, look, if it's in this bracket, we think it's a buy, depending on how we tasted it. It's going to be very interesting this time. Some people have priced the wine correctly the last 3 or 4 vintages. And yes, they need to come off, and they certainly can't be going up. But there might be instances where coming down only a little bit is okay. There are other wines that, frankly, have been out to lunch for quite a while and where they need to come down savagely. But what we can't do is expect the wines that are in the around about sort of £300 to £500 a dozen. We can't expect them to halve their price. Yeah. They're going to go out of business if they do that. Yeah. So it's going to be a very fine line to walk, I think.
There was an interesting bit of analysis done by somebody on the most successful chateaux over the last 5 years on primeur campaigns. And interestingly, there were some big names in there, some of the sort of famous names, but there were also some really under the radar names. And so to have this kind of subset of people who have got their finger on the pulse, and not because they're a big famous chateau, but because they're just pricing their wines in a way that means they sell, gives you some hope and shows that it can be done. If you really keep an ear to the ground in terms of where your market is, you can sell wines on primeur, even if you're not one of the big name chateaus.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think, okay, well, with a glimmer of hope, I'll leave you with to share with our listeners. This was a rumour that was circulated a couple of weeks ago about Lafite. I think it's totally fine to say. I mean, this hope may be extinguished very quickly when the campaign gets up and running, and it might not, bear any fruition at all. But we sort of heard that Lafite may be and is thinking about coming out around €240 a bottle, which, if they did, is akin to prices of 13 and 14. And what that means to the general public is roughly probably buying the case around sort of £750 for 3 bottles, which is significantly below any price, any vintage of Lafite. And the vintages we mentioned earlier are priced, that 21 to sort of 13. You can pick up a 21 for £1,000 a 3-pack, but the others will cost you $11.50. So if it was to come out of that, I believe it will definitely warrant a lot of attention. I think it not only would warrant, I think it will translate into people actually wanting to buy that, assuming the wine is of really quite good quality. And I'd be amazed if they didn't make a good wine, even in these sort of challenges of vintages.
I mean, we need a quick campaign. We need it to be on the money, for there to be any momentum to it. And on primeur is all about momentum. So it'll be really interesting. And of course, there'll be some gems that we haven't really talked about, sort of sweets or whites or anything like that. But I think, so what I'm sort of saying by that is that the conversation is mainly about the red side of things. We'll obviously taste those when we're out there, but it's going to be very, very interesting to see.
Yeah. One final sort of thought along that theme of positivity in general is that the younger generation of wine buyers, I think, are sort of interested in experiencing what Bordeaux has to offer and actually meeting people and doing tastings and getting out there and visiting estates. And finally, after arguably sort of 10 years of the doldrums, I think Bordeaux has actually got itself into gear and it's engaging with the end consumer. And I think this is good. And we haven't seen as many Bordeaux producers in London, for example, for years, as we are seeing now and over the last year or so. So I think the fact that they're willing to engage with the broader market is a good sign, and it's what people want. People don't want to just amass a collection of wine in the way that maybe previous generations did. They want to have a direct experience of the wine and the people who make it.
Yeah, you're right. And the cities and the city itself and Saint-Emilion places and Le Bourne, which was quite down, and that they're everywhere is on the up, and is a good place to go and visit. So I thoroughly recommend.
On the winemakers coming over, you by the time you hear this, you may have replied, you may have seen it. We've actually got 3.
It was two now.
Yes, now 3 paying a visit. On the 28th, on Monday the 28th of April, we've got Edouard Merckx coming in doing 3 masterclasses there, and Tuesday the 29th we have Francois Micheville and Peter Sissek, so exploring.
I don't think we've told anyone about Peter Sissek.
I know, there you go.
Only just confirmed.
Breaking news, but breaking incredibly slowly, which will probably be in next week by the time this is edited and dropped.
Yes, as you hear this on Tuesday or whatever it is.
Well, chaps, thanks very much. I find I'm very much looking forward to my fill of oysters and veal chops in Bordeaux.
Yeah, there is only one problem. You're going to be driving.
Yes, please don't get food poisoning on the first day, because we'll be stranded.
Exactly. Can you stay off the oysters while you deliver us to the right places?
So we know the rules. A driver gets to put his playlist on. So
right.
Get ready for heavy metal.
Pack the ear defenders.
As long as he doesn't miss the exit on the motorway, as has happened before.
This isn't Burgundy, guy. This is different. But yeah, thank you very much for listening. And Guy and Will, thanks very much. Cheers.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, well done, sir.